This is Thames from London. In 30 minutes, our local bulletin. First, the national news at the studios of ITN. It's 10 o'clock.
Dead in Lebanon as Arafat fights for his life. Unemployment down last month by 73,000. The Soviet nuclear sub is in trouble in the Atlantic. Fidel Castro watches his Cuban wounded come home. The bone marrow boy who may die because there's no money. Good evening. The PLO leader, Yasser Arafat, and his followers are tonight fighting for their lives in their last base near Tripoli in northern Lebanon. King Hussein of Jordan has appealed to Arab leaders to join in a rescue operation. Mr. Arafat and his men are under attack by Palestinian rebels backed by Syria. At least 60 people have been killed and more than 200 seriously injured as artillery and tank fire pounded the PLO positions, hitting an oil refinery and 2 refugee camps nearby. Rescue workers have been unable to get through to the 40,000 civilians in those camps. Tonight the rebels say they control the heights overlooking the camps and claim that many of Arafat's supporters are deserting to their side. There were earlier reports of an attempt to assassinate Mr. Arafat, but he's said to be broadcasting hourly messages to his troops on shortwave radio. David Smith reports on how Mr. Arafat has been preparing for what may be his last stand.
A year ago, as the PLO left Beirut amid gunfire and celebrations, Yasser Arafat was its undisputed leader, claiming moral victory out of military defeat. Yet today, Yasser Arafat is trapped in northern Lebanon, surrounded by rebels who deserted from his army and cut off from his supporters in the world outside because the Syrians control his way in and out of here. And the Syrians stand firmly behind those within the PLO who are now at war with Arafat.
What do you say to people who say that you are finished?
Silly.
You say it's silly?
Silly rumors from the Western mass media, some of the Western mass media. They are not imagining that we are here according to the will and the determination of our Palestinian people.
Has what has happened in the past few months to you, has it been rather humiliating, given everything a year ago, the position you were in?
I was in a siege 1 year ago. I am in another siege in this year. What is the difference? In 1976 we were in siege. In 1970 in Amman I was in a siege. It is not a picnic. It is a revolution.
Whether Arafat survives or not will ultimately depend on just how many hearts and minds he can retain among the Palestinian people at large. Here at his headquarters we found his men training children of 6 and 7 for the army, making sure they stay on Arafat's side of the Palestinian divide. But their future and that of the tens of thousands like them scattered across the Arab world is more bleak than ever, because no longer does the Palestinian cause speak with the one authoritative voice that was Arafat's, and no longer is anyone in the position, as Arafat was a year ago, to negotiate on behalf of all of them for that Palestinian homeland. David Smith, News at 10, Tripoli, northern Lebanon.
Lebanon's other warring factions, trying to sort out their differences in talks in Geneva, have asked President Gemayel to launch a new diplomatic initiative to remove all Israeli and foreign forces from their country. And they'll meet again tomorrow to consider consolidating the ceasefire that ended 3 weeks of civil war. One delegate said, "There's no winning side in this issue. If we continue like this, Lebanon will be the only winner."
Lebanon's President Amin Gemayel opened this morning's conference as first reports were coming in of the attack on Yasser Arafat's PLO positions in Tripoli. He appealed to all sides to stop fighting while reconciliation talks here were still going on. But his supporters could not conceal their irritation that the talks were bogged down over Lebanon's troop withdrawal agreement with Israel, while it was Syrian forces who were participating in the attacks on Arafat.
Look what's happening in Tripoli today. They're shelling Tripoli. Tripoli is not a Christian city, it's a Muslim city. They're shelling it today, and they're shelling it heavily. There's a lot of people being killed. They're now attacking 2 Palestinian camps.
Things are not looking very optimistic, are they?
Well, the moment we reach a little agreement here, the moment you see it's heated up back home. That's the Syrian tactic.
But the pro-Syrian faction, led by Druze leader Walid Jumblat, had clearly seized the initiative here. They maintain the Syrian presence in Lebanon could not be compared with Israel's.
Lebanon is an Arab country that belongs to the Arab community and has, traditionally speaking, historical known relations with Syria. When Lebanon will be freed from the Israel presence, then we will ask Syria to go out.
The reconciliation conference continues here tomorrow, but as happens so often in Lebanon's history, attempts at peace are being overshadowed by deeds of violence. Norman Rees, News at 10 in Geneva.
The Americans are tracking a Russian nuclear-powered submarine which they think is in trouble in the Atlantic. They discovered it almost 500 miles off Charleston in South Carolina, which is a major American submarine base.
The submarine was spotted in international waters by US Navy patrol planes. The Defense Department here says the sub appears to be in serious trouble, unable to dive and barely able to maintain headway. It's a Victor III nuclear attack submarine. The first Victor III was only built 4 years ago, and 8 have so far been launched. It has 8 nuclear missile launching tubes and can drop nuclear depth charges on other submarines. Spokesmen at the Defense Department here can hardly contain their delight at the find, particularly as the submarine is so recent. Its presence is not unusual, though its disability is. Russian submarines are known to patrol in that part of the Atlantic regularly. If the Russians aboard the craft do ask for help, the Americans will go to their assistance. Jon Snow, News at 10, Washington.
The Danish Parliament has ordered its minority government to work actively against the deployment of medium-range nuclear missiles in Europe. MPs voted by more than 8-1 against NATO plans to site cruise and Pershing missiles in the West. But the government survived the vote by agreeing only to pass on the Danish Parliament's views to its NATO partners.
Here at home, unemployment is down by more than 73,000 to just over 3 million, and the trend shown by the seasonally adjusted figures is also down. That's for the second time in 3 months. The TUC described the drop as a superficial improvement, but said the total reflected continuing depression.
Although the government is being ultra-cautious about the long-term significance of these figures, there's no doubt they're among the best since Mrs. Thatcher won the 1979 election. And there's a feeling among the Whitehall experts that they could just mark the turning point. There's plenty of circumstantial evidence. Overtime working is up, short-time working is down, redundancy figures are down, and job vacancies are at their best for 2.5 years. But the most telling statistic comes if you look at the seasonally adjusted trend. In the 6 months from last October, the average monthly rise in adult unemployment was 28,000. In the latest 6 months, that's come down to 9,000, and the signs are that's shrinking fast too. So although our rate of unemployment is still 1/6 above the rest of Europe, there are encouraging signs. There could be a big hiccup in January when unemployment normally rises sharply, but otherwise the signs are that there'll be a number of further falls in the months ahead. Well, the new Employment Secretary, Mr. Tom King, said the figures were distinctly encouraging and said the way to get more jobs was through lower inflation, and that meant lower pay settlements.
I'm very pleased to see the improvements that there have been this month. And, I mean, 70,000 fall in the overall total is obviously an encouraging development. Now, what we want to see, obviously, is a lower level. We can't have it by just wishing for it. We're going to have to work for it. We've worked for it so far by getting inflation down, by getting industry more competitive, Britain starting really to earn its living in the world. And that's the encouraging area where I think we can get more jobs.
The jury in the trial of Dennis Nielsen at the Old Bailey have been sent to a secret hotel for the night after they failed to reach their verdicts today. Nielsen has pleaded not guilty to 6 charges of murder and 2 of attempted murder on the grounds of diminished responsibility. The judge, Mr. Justice Croom Johnson, told the jury they had heard unforgettable tales of horror during the trial, but he warned them that that should not necessarily lead to the conclusion that Nielsen was mad.
The jury retired at 11:30 this morning. Later they asked for lunch to be brought to their private room, and after they'd been together for 4.5 hours, the judge called them back into court. He asked the foreman of the jury, "If you're given extra time tonight, is there any likelihood that you will reach a verdict?" The foreman replied, "No, my lord," and arrangements were made for the 8 men and 4 women to stay in a hotel overnight. In his summing up, Mr Justice Croom Johnson told the jury they must decide whether Nielsen had an abnormality of mind which caused diminished responsibility when he killed, or was he simply an evil and cruel man who killed because he liked to do so. He reminded the jury that no psychiatrist has said Nielsen was insane. All say, with different emphasis, that there is and was an abnormality of mind. But the prosecution psychiatrist stops there, saying there is no mental disorder or personality defect, so therefore he says there is no substantial impairment. Recalling the two defence psychiatrists, the judge recalled their claim that there was impairment of responsibility. He said, because there are two defence psychiatrists and only one for the prosecution, it doesn't mean defence wins. It's not like scoring goals. Nielsen has been on remand in Brixton Prison. He left the Old Bailey under heavy security tonight and will return to court tomorrow.
The Labour leader, Mr Kinnock, has launched what he called the Labour Party's campaign to save the National Health Service. He said Labour's warnings during the election that a Conservative government would do further serious damage had been tragically and quickly vindicated. In the Commons, Mrs Thatcher defended her government's policy.
There are now 640,000 more inpatient and day cases, 2 million more outpatient and emergency cases being treated, 18% more geriatric inpatients, 14% more geriatric outpatients, 1 million more courses of dental treatment, 620,000 more site tests, 400,000 more people, many elderly visited at home. That is a splendid improvement over the record of any previous government.
The Labour campaign was taken out onto the streets from party headquarters with Mr Kinnock in a special ambulance. It will tour Britain distributing information and staging exhibitions. The Health Minister, Mr Kenneth Clarke, today announced that the South London Hospital for Women will close next year despite a fierce campaign for its survival. It's the last general hospital in Britain which is run by women for women.
The defiant message outside the hospital took on a special irony tonight. The local women, MPs and nursing staff who'd been campaigning to keep the South London open had lost their fight. The hospital will close next April so that its running costs of £5 million a year can go towards the expansion of St George's Hospital in Tooting. The campaigners, though, say it provides a unique service. A high proportion of its patients are black or Asian, and many refuse to be treated by male doctors on religious grounds. News of the closure brought an angry reaction.
I think it's absolutely disgusting. There's not another finer hospital in London compared with this.
I don't want male doctors, really. You know, I've been examined by male doctors. You feel embarrassed. You're so relaxed. You're so calm here. And they're so gentle, where a man doctor isn't gentle.
I think people comes first, not violence.
I am horrified and aghast, and I think it's an appalling decision by the government, and one which they will regret.
But despite all the protests, Wandsworth Health Authority says the hospital is a luxury compared to other local priorities like facilities for the elderly and for the mentally ill. These, they say, are best served by the expansion of St George's Hospital. Sally Jones, News at 10 in South London.
The government's announced this week that it's providing an extra £650,000 over the next 18 months for bone marrow transplants. But the 6 London hospitals that perform the operation say that's not enough. Westminster Hospital in London told Mrs Shirley Twigger that they didn't have the facilities to treat her 6-year-old son, Adrian.
Adrian was born with a genetic disorder which is slowly killing him. The only treatment which might have saved him was a bone marrow transplant. But only a handful of hospitals can perform such an operation. He was referred to one in London, which already had 43 children on its waiting list. It takes the hospital almost a year to get through that number of operations. Their bone marrow clinic said there could be no treatment for Adrian.
Well, it was absolutely devastating, really, because that was the only treatment that I knew was available, and without it, Adrian had no chance at all.
And exactly what do you face now, then?
Really, just to watch him die in front of us. It's as simple as that. He's just going to get worse and worse, and it's very hard to see a child that you love die virtually in front of your eyes.
Britain performs more operations of this type than anywhere in the world, but for every case they accept, they have to turn away 6 more. Doctors say Adrian now cannot be saved. He'll go blind, become crippled and die within 6 years. The extra government money will pay for 60 more transplants, but 700 people need them every year.
No death is ever acceptable, although most doctors in medicine have always, as they will always, sometimes have to make difficult judgments about which patients to give priority to. What we do is we identify the patient needs and we direct the money to it. And I think one mustn't be misled by over-dramatic campaigning, by over-enthusiastic consultants, who I think give a misleading impression that people are dying through neglect.
London's Royal Free Hospital contains one of the most modern clinics in Europe for bone marrow transplants. But 9 years after it was built, this ward has still to treat a single patient. Less than £200,000 would open its doors. David Chater, News at 10 in London.
In Grenada, the American withdrawal is gathering speed. We'll have a special report on that in part 2. Also, the black civil rights leader who wants to run for president. And 7 Spurs fans are still seriously ill after last night's violence in Holland. That's in a couple of minutes.
Sir Paul Scoon, the Governor-General of Grenada, said tonight he would announce an interim government within a week and would hold elections open to all Grenadians within a year. In the Common Foreign Affairs debate, Sir Geoffrey Howe, the Foreign Secretary, said Sir Paul had welcomed Britain's offer to send a high-level team of advisers to Grenada, and that Britain would respond positively to requests for help. Our political correspondent, David Walter, asked Sir Geoffrey if Britain would be sending police and troops there.
I would think it's relatively unlikely that we shall be involved in sending significant numbers. We're much more likely, I suspect, to be involved in offering advice and guidance and leadership of some kind. Perhaps, I don't know. He may take the view, and it's entirely for the Grenadian government to decide, that they can have all their needs met, or most of them, in another way. What we're trying to do is to make sure that all our partners in the Commonwealth are ready in a positive fashion to do their bit when the time comes, if we're asked to do so.
The American ambassador to the United Nations, Mrs. Jean Kirkpatrick, has said Mrs. Thatcher misunderstood the whole basis of the US action in Grenada. During a satellite interview linked to Europe, she said America hadn't invaded because of the island's communist government, but to rescue Americans. She suggested there were as many Americans in Grenada as there were British citizens on the Falklands. President Reagan tonight confirmed he's pulling his troops out of Grenada. He said America's objectives had been achieved. He called the American dead and wounded heroes of freedom, and he clashed angrily with a reporter who questioned the operation.
Mr. President, some people say that the U.S. has now lost the moral high ground, that there's no difference between what we did in Grenada and what the Soviets did in Afghanistan. What's your response to that?
Oh, for heaven's sakes, anyone who would link Afghanistan to this operation, and incidentally, I know your frequent use of the word invasion, this was a rescue mission. But in Afghanistan, if you will recall, when the Soviets installed their choice of head of state for Afghanistan, and in the process in changing the forces there, an American ambassador was murdered in Afghanistan.
American forces on Grenada began winding down their presence this afternoon. More than 2,000 soldiers are being flown back to the United States, but at least 2,000 others will remain until at least the interim government has been formed. While they were leaving, it was stalemate at the Cuban embassy, where the ambassador who's been ordered out refuses to go until all Cubans have been evacuated. The last remnants of the Marxist dream for Grenada, more than 600 captured Cubans, are waiting to go home. In the ghetto area, where the air is filled with the pungent smell of marijuana, Grenadians who largely supported the old Bishop regime are cautious about what comes next. They claim the People's Revolution gave them hope. The question everyone here is asking is who will occupy the Prime Minister's residence.
There will be no prohibition of any party. One of the tasks of the provisional government will be to prepare the way for free elections.
Sir Paul will announce the government next week. It will not be made up of politicians and will probably run the country for at least 6 months. After 4 years' neglect, the old parliamentary house is a shambles.
leading Grenadians want more than just free elections.
The quickest way is to rebuild our economy. Don't send us food aid or blankets. Give us scholarships, send us technicians, and send us tourists. We have a wonderful country.
The confidence needed to bring back foreign visitors cannot be maintained until there's a truly representative government. But already there are those who helped Maurice Bishop to power, saying that with America breathing down their necks, the elections will not reflect all political opinion. Brent Sadler, News at 10, Grenada.
57 Cubans wounded in the fighting in Grenada have been flown home aboard a Red Cross jet. They were taken straight to hospital, but they got a hero's welcome first.
Beyond a fleet of military and civilian ambulances, the Red Cross DC-8 taxied in 3 days later than expected after diplomatic wrangling over the Cubans' return. Fidel Castro was there, looking strained, betraying the fact that this was a national and personal setback. The 57 wounded Cubans and the dead still in Grenada are the victims of the first ever Cuban military clash with the United States. 2/3 walked off. Each received a personal welcome from Castro. Some of the wounded were too ill to respond. Others waved, clearly relieved to be home after the long wait in US military custody on Grenada. The welcome was restrained, the crowd small. Fidel Castro, the Cuban commander-in-chief, stepped forward with a few words to clasp hands. No one clapped or showed any emotion. Cubans had been asked to stay away. There was no reunion with relatives at the airport. Crowds lined the route into the city, ignoring official announcements, to watch the 57 ambulances pass. For a week, hospitals had been on standby to receive the wounded. There still appear to be formidable problems and delays ahead before the Cuban dead and the 600 prisoners are returned here. Only then will there be a state funeral and a renewal of mass demonstrations of anti-American feeling by the Cubans. Nick Gowing, News at 10, Havana.
White South Africans have voted by a 2-to-1 majority for a new constitution which will give the small coloured and Asian communities limited parliamentary rights. The 21 million blacks who outnumber whites by 5-to-1 played no part in the referendum. 66% of the white electorate, 1.36 million, voted for the constitutional reforms and 34%, 691,000, against. Of the 15 electoral districts, only one, Petersburg, on the border with Zimbabwe, voted no.
The Reverend Jesse Jackson has become the first black candidate for the presidency of the United States. Announcing that he would seek the Democratic nomination, the 8th candidate to do so, Mr. Jackson said he wanted to restore a moral tone of peace and fairness to America.
Every song in the book is being adjusted. Hello, Jesse was but one. Long before the announcement, the crowd was being warmed up by the survivors of the 60s civil rights movement, upon which Jackson has built his campaign. So, to the entrance of the first black ever to seriously challenge for the Democrat Party nomination to be the candidate for president. Though there are divisions amongst the 14 million black voters here as to whether he should run, he's devised a coalition of blacks, Hispanics,